January 1943. High above the Solomon Islands, the air is thin and cold, even under the tropical sun. A Japanese naval aviator pulls back on the control stick. His Mitsubishi A6M0 climbs smoothly at first, engine humming, wings light, familiar. Below him, the ocean fractures into scattered islands and cloud shadow. Ahead, an American fighter twin-engined, heavy, inelegant by Japanese standards, begins to climb away. At first this is expected. The Zero has always been able to follow, but seconds pass. Then more, the American aircraft keeps rising, steadily, relentlessly, its climb unbroken, the gap does not close. It widens. The Japanese pilot feels the engine strain. The air thins, the Zero's advantage, its lightness, its grace starts to fade. He knows this altitude, he has fought here before. But this time the enemy does not level off. It does not stall. It does not slow. It simply keeps climbing. In that quiet moment above the Pacific, something settles in. Not panic, not fear, but realization. The rules of the sky have changed, and with that realization comes a question that will haunt Japanese pilots for the rest of the war. How do you fight an enemy who can always choose to be higher? When the Pacific War began in December 1941, Japanese naval aviation stood at the peak of its power. For more than a decade, the Imperial Japanese Navy had prepared for a single decisive conflict. Its air arm was built around a clear philosophy, individual pilot skill, absolute aircraft maneuverability, and aggressive offensive spirit. Japanese planners believed that air combat would be decided in close-range engagements, where sharp turns, quick reflexes, and experience mattered more than raw machine performance. The aircraft that embodied this doctrine was the Mitsubishi A6M0. Lightweight, long-ranged, and extraordinarily maneuverable, the Zero was designed with sacrifices deliberately made elsewhere. Armor protection was minimal. Self-sealing fuel tanks were absent. Speed and climb were prioritized only to the extent that they supported turning combat. The assumption was simple and confident. If a Japanese pilot could get into a dogfight, he would win. In the early months of the war, this belief appeared unshakable. Over China, Southeast Asia, and the opening battles of the Pacific, Japanese pilots dominated the skies. Experienced aviators, many trained through years of combat in China, faced Allied pilots who were often undertrained, flying aircraft still burdened by pre-war assumptions. British Buffaloes, Dutch fighters, and early American types struggled to survive against the Zero's agility. Reports from 1941 and early 1942 consistently described the same pattern. Allied pilots attempted to turn with the Zero and were cut down. Formation discipline broke. Confidence eroded. Japanese airmen spoke openly of technical and spiritual superiority. This success reinforced doctrine rather than questioning it. Japanese pilot training was among the most rigorous in the world, but also among the longest and most selective. Only a small fraction of candidates ever reached combat units. Those who did were elite, polished, and deeply confident in their abilities. The system produced exceptional aviators, but in limited numbers and with the assumption that experience, once gained, would be preserved. Aircraft design followed the same logic. Japanese engineers, constrained by limited industrial resources, chose to invest in performance through weight reduction rather than engine power. The Zero's Nakajima Sake engine was reliable, but modest compared to what American industry could field. Instead of adding horsepower, designers removed metal. Every kilogram saved improved range and maneuverability. Protection was seen as unnecessary, even dishonorable. This approach made sense within Japan's strategic worldview. The Imperial Navy expected a short, decisive war. The United States, they believed, would lack the will for prolonged conflict. A series of early defeats would force negotiation. In such a war, elite pilots flying superbly maneuverable aircraft could deliver a crushing blow before industrial strength mattered. But this confidence carried an unseen vulnerability. The doctrine assumed that the nature of air combat would remain static, that future battles would resemble those of the late 1930s. It assumed that enemies would accept turning engagements. It assumed that altitude was merely a prelude to combat, not a weapon in itself. Across the Pacific, however, a different philosophy was forming, quietly, slowly, and at first, painfully. American air units entered the war unprepared, but not inflexible. Early losses forced analysis. Combat reports were studied, enemy strengths were mapped. And among those observations, one fact began to stand out with unsettling clarity. The zero was unbeatable in a turn dot, so the Americans began to ask a different question: what if turning no longer mattered? That question would reshape the air war in the Pacific, but its answer would not arrive overnight. It would come with altitude, patience, and machines built not for elegance, but for endurance. By mid-1942, the United States was losing aircraft and learning fast. The early months of the Pacific Air War had been brutal. At Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, over Wake Island and Java, American and Allied pilots were outflown and outmaneuvered. Many of their fighters were technically inferior, but more damaging was the mindset with which they were flown. American pilots entered combat expecting turning engagements, expecting symmetrical fights, and expecting that courage alone could close the gap. It could not. Survivors began to notice patterns. The Zero climbed well at low and medium altitudes, but its performance flattened higher up. Its engine lacked a supercharger capable of sustaining power in thin air. Its control surfaces, so responsive in tight turns, became less forgiving as speed increased. And most importantly, once committed to a maneuvering fight, the Zero bled energy quickly. These observations circulated through squadrons, intelligence briefings, and training manuals. The answer was not to build a better turning fighter. The answer was to refuse the turn altogether. This shift coincided with the arrival of a very different kind of aircraft. In the Pacific, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was almost the Zero's opposite. Twin-engined, heavy, complex, and fast, it was powered by two Allison V1710 engines equipped with turbo superchargers. These allowed the aircraft to maintain power at high altitude, where thinner air crippled most Japanese fighters. The Lightning did not excel in tight dogfights, but it possessed something far more decisive: it could climb and keep climbing. In the skies over Guadalcanal and New Guinea, American pilots began to exploit altitude as a form of control. They climbed above Japanese formations before contact. They attacked from above, diving at high speed, firing in a single pass, then pulling up and away out of reach. This was not instinctive flying. It required discipline. New tactics were formalized. The boom and zoom attack replaced the turning dogfight. Thatch-weave formations, developed earlier in the war, allowed less maneuverable aircraft to defend each other through coordinated movement rather than individual skill. Energy, altitude, and speed became currency. It was spent carefully, never squandered in prolonged engagement. Japanese pilots noticed the change immediately. American fighters no longer chased. They did not circle. They appeared suddenly from above, struck hard, and disappeared into the sky. Attempts to follow ended in frustration. Zeros climbed, stalled, and fell behind. Engines overheated. Wings trembled near their limits. And it wasn't just the P-38. As the war progressed, newer American aircraft arrived. The F-6F Hellcat combined heavy firepower with durability. The P-47 Thunderbolt brought immense engine power and high-altitude performance. Later still, the P-51 Mustang extended this philosophy even further. All shared the same fundamental advantage: powerful engines, robust construction, and the ability to choose when and how to fight. Behind these machines stood American industry. Losses could be replaced. Squadrons could be rotated. Pilots could be trained in large numbers under standardized programs. Experience was institutionalized, not individualized. Tactical lessons were shared rapidly, codified, and enforced. Japan could not match this pace. As American aircraft climbed higher and stayed there longer, Japanese pilots were forced into a defensive posture they had never trained for. The sky, once their domain, began to feel constrained. Every engagement now carried an invisible ceiling, one they could see, but not reach. And in that widening vertical gap, confidence began to erode. What had once been a contest of skill was becoming a contest of physics and production. That realization would crystallize not in theory, but in combat, when pilots looked up and understood with painful clarity that the enemy owned the altitude. From that point forward, the war in the air would no longer be fought on equal terms. For Japanese pilots, the realization did not arrive as a briefing or an order. It arrived in the cockpit. Many of these aviators had entered the war undefeated. Some had flown since the late 1930s, surviving China, Pearl Harbor, and the first months of the Pacific Campaign. They trusted their aircraft. More importantly, they trusted their understanding of air combat. The Zero had never betrayed them before. But by late 1942 and into 1943, something subtle changed in the tone of after-action reports. Pilots described American fighters that would not engage, that refused to turn. That appeared above them without warning and vanished upward before retaliation was possible. In interviews conducted after the war, several Japanese aviators recalled the same emotion: not fear, but frustration. A sense of helplessness, the feeling of being outplayed without being outflown. One veteran described pulling into a climb, watching the American aircraft continue upward, and realizing there was no tactical answer. Another spoke of anger at the machine, at the sky, and at the realization that skill could no longer bridge the gap. The Zero was still graceful, still deadly in the right conditions, but those conditions were no longer being offered. In air combat, altitude is potential energy. Whoever owns it controls the engagement. American pilots learned to treat altitude not as a starting point, but as a weapon. A fighter above its opponent could choose to attack or disengage at will. A fighter below could only react. The Zero, optimized for low and mid-altitude maneuvering, could not sustain long climbs without sacrificing speed and stability. Once American fighters established a vertical separation, the engagement became one-sided. Japanese pilots attempting to follow burned fuel rapidly, overheated engines, and entered the danger zone of stall. The climb itself became a trap. This transformed combat rhythm. Battles were shorter, less chaotic, more clinical. Japanese formations, trained for sweeping offensive action, found themselves constantly adjusting, constantly looking upward, constantly on the defensive. The heart of the imbalance lay in engines. American aircraft were built around horsepower. Turbo superchargers allowed engines to breathe at altitude. Structural strength allowed pilots to dive at speeds Japanese aircraft could not safely follow. Weight, once considered a liability, became an asset. It preserved momentum. Japanese engineers had made rational choices under constraint, but those choices locked their aircraft into a narrow performance envelope. Outside it, there was no margin. And once American pilots learned to live outside that envelope, the Zero's brilliance became irrelevant. This widening gap, human, tactical, and technological, did not yet mean defeat. But it meant, at the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the changing nature of air combat was slow to be acknowledged. Japanese aviation doctrine was deeply tied to pre-war assumptions about honor, initiative, and decisive battle. The idea that combat could be avoided struck only on favorable terms, then abandoned ran counter to long-held beliefs. Victory was expected to come through engagement, not denial. Reports from the front describing American fighters that refused to turn were often interpreted as cowardice rather than strategy. The solution, in many cases, was believed to be more aggression, more spirit, more pressure. Aircraft limitations were downplayed. Pilot adaptability was expected to compensate. But adaptability has limits. As veteran pilots were lost. Their replacements arrived with fewer flight hours and less combat seasoning. The training pipeline, once Japan's greatest strength, could not accelerate without sacrificing quality. Experience so central to Japanese success early in the war became a dwindling resource. The doctrine had been built for excellence, not resilience, for American pilots. The discovery of vertical superiority was transformative. Early encounters with the Zero had been demoralizing. But once tactics shifted, confidence returned. Pilots reported a growing sense of control, knowing they could engage on their terms. Altitude became safety. Speed became escape. Survival rates improved. This did not eliminate danger. Japanese pilots were still deadly if allowed close, but the fear changed shape. It became conditional, manageable. American after-action reports increasingly emphasized patience. Do not turn. Do not chase. Climb first. The sky itself had become an ally. There was nothing inherently flawed about Japanese pilots. They were brave, skilled, and disciplined. But they were asked to fight a changing war with an unchanging framework. As American aircraft climbed higher and returned home with damage that would have destroyed a Zero, Japanese pilots faced a moral strain. Each engagement carried the knowledge that survival might depend less on decision-making and more on physics. Some adapted, others pressed harder. Many did not return. By 1943, the air war was no longer balanced. The Zero still appeared in the sky, but no longer as a symbol of inevitability. Instead, it became a reminder of a moment past. That moment would reach its breaking point in a series of engagements where altitude was not just an advantage, but a verdict. The turning point did not arrive in a single battle. It emerged across a series of skies. By early 1943, the airspace over the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the approaches to Rabaul had become laboratories of adaptation. Here, altitude was no longer incidental. It was contested deliberately, methodically, and with consequences that Japanese pilots could feel almost immediately. Over Guadalcanal, American P-38 Lightnings began flying high-cover missions well above Japanese patrol altitude. Radar stations provided early warning. Fighters climbed long before contact, sometimes for an hour or more, engines droning steadily as they built an invisible advantage. When Japanese formations arrived, Zeros escorting bombers, often flying low to conserve fuel, they were already at a disadvantage they could not see. American attacks came from above the sun, a sudden flash, a short burst of cannon and machine gun fire. Then the attackers were gone, climbing steeply back into the thin air. Japanese pilots instinctively pulled up to follow. Many stalled, some spun. Others simply watched the enemy disappear. Combat reports from this period grow increasingly specific and increasingly grim. Japanese pilots noted that American fighters retreated upward, beyond reach. They described engines losing power above certain altitudes, controls becoming heavy, climb rates collapsing. Zero, once a master of the sky, had a ceiling it could not ignore. In April 1943, during operations around New Guinea, these encounters intensified. American fighters, now more numerous and better coordinated, systematically targeted experienced Japanese pilots. The goal was no longer just to protect bombers, it was to break the enemy's air arm. Losses mounted. What made this phase decisive was not just the number of aircraft destroyed, but the pattern. Japanese pilots were not losing in chaotic dogfights. They were being denied combat altogether. Engagements ended before they could apply their skills. The Zero's strengths, turning, agility, pilot, finesse were never allowed to matter. One Japanese aviator later recalled that chasing American fighters upward felt like climbing into emptiness. The enemy was always just beyond reach, always faster in the vertical. The sky, once open and familiar, had acquired boundaries. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 underscored this shift. American aircraft dominated the airspace, striking Japanese convoys repeatedly, unchallenged at altitude. Japanese fighter cover struggled to intercept. Those that tried were drawn upward and neutralized. The implications were unmistakable. Altitude control meant bombing accuracy. It meant escort effectiveness. It meant survival. By mid-1943, Japanese pilots no longer asked whether they could outfly American aircraft. They asked whether they could reach them at all. And as these questions went unanswered, the realization hardened this was no longer a temporary disadvantage. It was structural. The decisive phase was approaching, when the imbalance would no longer be survivable. Even for the most skilled pilots Japan had left. By the second half of 1943, the air war reached a point where denial replaced contest. American air units no longer sought parity. They sought dominance measured not by dogfights won, but by airspace controlled. Over Rebel, over Bougainville, over the approaches to the Philippines, American fighters began operating at altitudes Japanese aircraft could not routinely challenge. This was where the imbalance became fatal. Japanese pilots climbing to intercept American formations found themselves arriving late, low, and exhausted. Engines strained long before combat began. Fuel consumption spiked. Once contact was made, American fighters did not stay. They struck once, twice at most, then climbed away, safe, untouched, unreachable. Attempts to adapt came too late. Newer Japanese fighters, like the Ki-84 and N-1KJ, showed promise on paper. But production delays, fuel shortages, and pilot inexperience blunted their impact. Even when capable aircraft appeared, the ecosystem that made American air power effective radar, coordination, numbers, and logistics could not be replicated. Veteran pilots continued to fall. The loss of experience was catastrophic. Japanese air doctrine relied on elite skill, passed informally through mentorship and combat. When those veterans died, their knowledge died with them. Replacement pilots entered combat with fewer hours, facing enemies who not only flew superior machines, but flew them within a system designed to preserve lives. In combat after combat, Japanese pilots found themselves forced into impossible choices. Stay low and avoid interception, or climb and risk losing control, fuel, and life. Either option ceded initiative. The emotional toll was severe. Post-war testimonies described pilots watching American fighters spiral upward and knowing, with certainty, that pursuit was futile. Some spoke of shouting and frustration inside their oxygen masks. Others described tears forming not from fear, but from the realization that courage no longer altered outcomes. By late 1943, American air superiority was no longer debated. It was operational fact. Altitude belonged to the Americans. Tempo belonged to the Americans. Survival increasingly belonged to those who could disengage at will. For Japanese pilots, the sky had become a narrowing space bounded not by clouds, but by physics and production. The turning point was complete. What followed was not recovery, but consequence measured in attrition, exhaustion, and the slow collapse of an air arm that could no longer climb into the future. After the turning point, the numbers began to speak with clarity. By 1944, Japanese naval and army air units were losing aircraft faster than they could be replaced. More damaging than material losses was the disappearance of experienced pilots. In the early war, Japan had fielded airmen with hundreds, sometimes thousands of flight hours. By the final year of the conflict, many replacements entered combat with fewer than 100. The imbalance widened with every engagement. American aircraft returned from missions riddled with holes damage that would have destroyed a Zero outright. Pilots survived to fly again, to refine tactics, to teach. Japanese pilots did not have that luxury. A single hit to an unprotected fuel tank often meant fire, explosion, and death. Altitude dominance amplified this disparity. American fighters could escort bombers deep into contested airspace. They could patrol above invasion fleets. They could loiter, choose targets, and disengage when necessary. Japanese fighters, limited by range and climb, were increasingly reactive, scrambling late, arriving low, and fighting uphill. Strategically, this changed everything. Air superiority allowed the United States to isolate battlefields. Supply lines were severed. Reinforcements were delayed or destroyed in transit. Ground forces faced constant air attack without effective cover. The Japanese military, once aggressive and expansive, was forced into a defensive posture across the Pacific. Reports from Japanese commanders grew increasingly stark. Requests for better aircraft, more fuel, and revised tactics went unanswered or were fulfilled too slowly to matter. Industrial capacity could not close the gap. Fuel shortages limited training. Radar coverage remained incomplete. The sky was no longer contested. For Japanese pilots, each sortie became an exercise in endurance rather than initiative. Survival depended on avoiding engagement rather than winning it. The psychological shift was profound. Confidence gave way to caution, then resignation. The air war had not simply been lost, it had become unwinnable. But the consequences did not stop with air units alone. The collapse of aerial control reshaped the entire conflict, from naval engagements to island invasions, sealing outcomes long before ground forces clashed. Those broader effects would define the final phase of the Pacific War. By 1944 and into 1945, American air dominance had become the foundation of every major operation in the Pacific. Carrier task forces moved with confidence, shielded by layers of fighter patrols that Japanese aircraft could rarely penetrate. Strategic bombing intensified, not just against industrial targets, but against airfields themselves. Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground as often as in the air, unable to contest altitude long enough to protect their own bases. The consequences were cumulative and irreversible. Without air cover, naval movements became suicidal. Convoys were spotted early, tracked, and attacked repeatedly. The fate of the Japanese fleet at Leyte Gulf was shaped long before surface ships exchanged fire. American aircraft dictated when and where engagements occurred, while Japanese forces reacted under constant pressure. Japanese attempts to regain parity grew increasingly desperate. Late war measures emphasized sacrifice over sustainability. Aircraft were simplified, training was shortened further. In the final stages, pilots were asked to trade altitude and maneuverability for direct impact. The logic of air combat, once rooted in mastery of the sky, collapsed into acceptance of inevitability. American pilots, by contrast, flew within a system designed to keep them alive. Aircraft improvements continued. Tactics evolved. Lessons from one battle were applied to the next. Altitude remained central not as a dramatic advantage, but as an assumed condition of every mission. The Zero, once feared across the Pacific, became a symbol of the war's opening phase, a reminder of how quickly dominance could evaporate when doctrine froze and the enemy adapted. Post-war assessments from both sides converged on the same conclusion. Japan had entered the air war with exceptional pilots and elegant machines, but without the capacity to absorb loss or adjust fast enough. The Americans, battered early, had turned defeat into data. By the end, the sky itself told the story. It was no longer a shared space. It was stratified, layered by altitude, technology, and industry. And in that vertical divide, the outcome of the Pacific War was written long before the final surrender. The story of the Pacific Air War is often told through numbers: aircraft lost, sorties flown, pilots killed. But the true measure lies in the sky itself. For Japanese aviators, the realization that American fighters could climb forever was more than a tactical disadvantage. It was a moment when the rules of engagement, the very logic of combat, were rewritten above the Pacific. Skill, bravery, and experience, once paramount, became insufficient against physics and industrial scale. Courage alone could not reach the heights that survival demanded. For the Americans, victory was incremental. It was built in altitude, in endurance, and in the patient accumulation of advantage. One climb, one disciplined attack, one carefully preserved formation at a time. The sky, once an arena of near-equal contest, became a layered instrument of control. The lesson extends beyond warplanes. It is a reminder that technological and strategic foresight can outpace individual talent. That adaptation is as critical as valor. That even the most elegant design or the most seasoned pilot can be rendered ineffective if the world changes faster than one can respond. Above the Solomons, above New Guinea, above the vast Pacific expanse, the battle for altitude was a silent reckoning. Japanese pilots cried not for lost honor, but for a future they could no longer reach. And in that quiet, the shape of modern air warfare was revealed: vertical advantage. Industrial endurance and tactical patience would decide conflicts long before bombs fell or bullets struck. The sky had spoken, and history, as always, listened.